Okay. Again, good afternoon, colleagues. The other side of the Atlantic River. Good to be back with you again today to continue our capacity building, or I will say training or explanation of what most of us believe, what is the convention, how does it work. We interpret a few of the elements, and now moving on into this famous agreement, the Paris Agreement. Is one of the most, in my opinion, fabulous agreement, because getting consensus within 195, 196 party is not an easy task. So we did that back in 2050, and this is what I will try to cover today. First of all, I would like to ask if there is any question from last session. It was a very long session, 3-hour sessions. I am sure that I provide with a lot of information of the convention, of the Kyoto Protocol, how everything works internally. It is no easy task to do when you're going to these events, but just want to be sure that if you would like to highlight something that wasn't too clear last time, this is the time before we keep moving into the Paris Agreement.
Je vois que Marianne a une question.
Oui, tout à fait. Et bonjour à tous. Moi, c'est Mariam Bouraïma de l'ONG MPB au Bénin et point focal de IPACC au Bénin. La séance de la dernière fois a été enrichissante, mais je n'ai pas pu suivre jusqu'à la fin pour un souci logistique. J'avais cependant une question en suspens que je souhaiterais poser à M. Eduardo. Nous savons tous que dès le novembre prochain, on aura COP27 en Égypte. Cependant, ma question est de savoir, est-ce que lors de la COP27, on va faire le bilan de la COP26 pour savoir si les pays ont eu à mettre en œuvre les recommandations issues de la COP26, et en fonction de ça, si c'est en fonction de ça, il faut dégager d'autres perspectives, ou comment ça se fait? Merci beaucoup.
No, Lawrence, I'm sorry, I was just listening everything in French. Not quite sure how to.
Okay. Eduardo? Sorry, Eduardo, you can put traduction, and you can have the interpretation in English.
How did I do that?
But
I know you told me last time, but
okay. Yes, you have to click close to share your screen. You have to click on translation or traduction.
Pause.
And you can select French or English. Did you find it?
No, I mean, you asked me to press pause sharing, right?
It's at the right of share your screen.
It's pause sharing.
You have traduction or translation. It's a globe. It's a globe that allow you.
Interpretation. That's okay. I think I got it here in English. I believe I have it.
You find it?
I think so. I press something to say interpretation in English. Yes, I got it. I have it.
Ok, donc je vais. Okay.
Yes.
Je vais répéter la question de Marianne du coup en français. que vous aurez en anglais.
Please.
La question est, est-ce que à la COP 27, il y a un récapitulatif de ce qui s'est passé à la COP 26?
It is actually there is not a review that what happened in COP26 that we will do in COP27. What we will continue is with issues that didn't have complete clarification, or the mandate was to continue discussions on COP27, which is this COP this year. The points related to forests. I want to highlight that many of the forest issues were completed when we finished the REP+ negotiations back in 2014 in Lima. And then, of course, that forest negotiation was, the decisions were included in the Paris Agreement, which is the Article 5. The only remaining issue related to forests was the one that we were discussing under Article 6 that deals with carbon markets and non-carbon markets. How do we engage the decisions of behind Article 5, REP+ decision, into the Article 6? So not everything is clear from the decision that we got out of Glasgow regarding to forests. As a fact, we were fighting hard with some African countries too, to recognize all the results that countries achieve when implementing the REP+ strategy, following all the Article 5 requirements. That was not officially achieved, that was not officially left out. So this is a discussion, of course. It is, if you read the text, and we will read it probably today, if you read the text, the language in the text is kind of vague. And of course, by the end of this month, I guess today, if I'm not mistaken, or tomorrow, countries were in the capacity to present submissions to the convention on issues that weren't too clear out of the text of Glasgow. So regarding again to the question, is not a review. It is more continuous the discussion that was not clear. And one of them is the one linked to REP+, specifically because there is a language in the decision text that talks about emissions avoidance, which allows countries to continue the discussion this year. Emissions avoidance are linked to conservation of carbon stock, but at the same time it's linked to keeping oil underground. So we need to have this discussion in a much broader way. We need to request clarification among ourselves, among our all the parties, and fight for something. This is one way that one topic that I believe we will be discussing first of all in June in Bonn, and of course in November in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, where the COP will take place, and go from there. Another important point from the decision text is that the Article 5 decisions, the ones that are in the Article 5, supporting Article 5, weren't too clear if that's going to be accepted under Article 6. Some groups believe it does. I believe it does. Or some other groups believe it doesn't. So this is still confusing. The language isn't clear. And of course, that brings other points into the discussion that we need to clarify. And that will be part of the discussion, specifically because many, and I could say that many of the African countries were disappointed with the text decision out of Glasgow, and hopefully we will bring, I would say, more ammunition to this discussion this year and get clarification to get clarification on the topics related to forest and Article 6, and to actually what countries are looking is that the forest, specifically conservation, all the efforts that we have been doing the last 6-7 years to put all the requirements under Article 5 in place or implemented in our countries be recognized. And one important of those points is that the Article 6 decisions out of Glasgow does not recognize any pre-2020 results. And most of the countries were preparing baselines from historical baseline up to 2015, up to 2016, showing results up to 2020. So that was left out officially in the text, and that's a fight that we still need to do. So that's more or less regarding to forests. I'm pretty sure there are other topics that will request more clarification, which means more discussion. Did I answer the question?
Merci beaucoup. Oui, c'est bon.
Now, having said so, and as you probably saw from last Wednesday presentation, this is a party-driven process. This is not an NGO or observers or press or anyone else process. This is a party-driven process. And the party-driven process starts at the national level. The national level is when we need to start doing some connections with the authorities or whoever is going to COPs on behalf of that ex-country. And as I was mentioning to the Mesoamerican group last Monday, first of all, you need to unify your positions. You need to, among yourself as a group, as an NGO, as an organization, you need to unify your position. You need to be sure what is exactly what you want to achieve from the negotiators into this COPs. Because at the COPs, the chance of getting or the chance to influence in decisions are very low. Most of the country leave most of the negotiators leave the countries with a mandate, with an official mandate, which in principle, in theory, has been discussed within the many different stakeholders within the countries and also within regional groups. I need to recognize and highlight that the African group is a very unique group. I always see that there is a lot of common understanding in what they are fighting. You don't see too many difference between one, when you are negotiating one topic. I mean, you have a strong voice, whoever is the leader of the negotiation for that specific topic. And my understanding is that you get many of these agreement as a result of many meetings that you have from, I mean, I'm pretty sure from the beginning of this year all the way before we get to the next session, with the next session in June. Now, that is the point when we need to bring our issues, our topics, because when you're having all these negotiations within your region, within your country, I am pretty sure that everyone express whatever interest is is for you. And I'm sure, because I have seen it, that the forest is important. Specifically, the Congo Basin countries always fight hard for the forest. But now how we transmit the importance of the forest to the economical discussion, that's something else. And sometimes most of our forest representatives in many of our developing countries are not connected to the financial discussions, are not connected to the carbon market discussion, are not connected to the non-carbon market discussion. And then there is a gap between those two. And of course, whoever is leading this negotiation will bring some points that probably won't be the most appropriate to valorate our forest. And this is important because personal, I believe, and I got it also from indigenous groups that, when we are at this call, you meet a lot of people, and sometimes we get together with them, and they always looking, how do we get economic incentives for the activities that we are doing? We are conserving forests, blah, blah, blah. And you say, well, this is exactly the fight that we are doing, but it's not an easy fight because we have to get consensus among 194, 195 countries that are engaged in this discussion. And that's the big challenge. If we don't have clarity from the beginning at the national level, whoever is going to be the national negotiator, whoever is going to be representing the interest of the African region, if he is not well aware of what is happening from the forest sector expectation, then we have a weak position when we are negotiating. So this is very important to highlight because everything starts at home. And yesterday, I was reviewing within my region, the Mesoamerican region, the NDCs of all our countries here, and then compare it with the forest reference emissions level or forest reference level. The forest reference emissions level or forest reference level are the baselines that we need to build in order to claim results. And I realized that few countries has the 5 RED+ activities, which is reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, conservation of forest carbon stock, which is one that the feeling that I have is that the indigenous people and forest communities are always fighting. Sustainable management of forests as well as enhancement of carbon stock, which is when you do reforestation, afforestation, agroforestry, pastorate projects. And I realized that not every country has the baseline regarding to those 5 RED+ activities. And of course, if you don't have that in your baseline, it's going to be very difficult to claim results. And my advice to them was, if you read the NDC first, yes, everyone cares about the forest. But then when you implement what you need to present before the UNFCCC Secretariat to be reviewed or for the reviewing process, your activity is not presented officially, so no one will validate or verify that activity. So at the end, whatever results you will have will be out of the activity that you were interested. So my advice to them was, first, you need to be sure that in your national determined contribution of your country, the forest issues are there. I could see it is there. Yes, I didn't doubt it, at least from the ones that I reviewed within my region. But then when I saw the forest reference level they presented before the convention, conservation issues were out. that is a very important point to highlight, that you need to know that this is happening and that will trigger possibles. And I'm saying possible because the clarity of the Article 644 is not well defined yet. That will trigger possible inputs. Remember that this is a very hard fight to get finance. Finance is one of the main points of discussion under these negotiations, specifically when we were expecting to have 100,000 of million of US dollar or 100 billion of US dollar by 2020. It is 2022, and we only have, you check the webpage of the Green Climate Fund, we only have 10,000 or 10 billion US dollars, so only 10% of what was officially adopted and agreed. And we don't know if we will have it. According to meetings that I attended in Glasgow last year, maybe by next year, but for sure by 2025. Is it true? It is false? We don't know. But that is another fight. And that's why we like to engage always the private sector. But the countries needs to do the homework before we present results to whoever might recognize those rates. But we don't include conservation, which in principle is one of the activities that I believe the indigenous people and forest communities always are fighting. I have heard so personally. Then it's going to be left out of the payments. That's one point. And I always mention district question, and don't get tired of highlighting district question, that we need to know where we are. We need to know where we're going to go, and we need to know how do we get where we want to go. Maybe the second and the third one are the ones that we always say, yes, I would like to be here, I would like to go there, blah, blah, blah. And the way that I would like to get there is by implementing these X, Y, and Z projects. However, when you ask where we are, nobody really knows where we are. So the journey cannot start because that important question cannot be answered. And a question for you guys is, if you know where we are regarding to your common positions that you would like to request to your different countries where you are based. This is important. You already got a common position within you as a group. I believe you do, but I'm not 100% sure of if that is a common agreement among you, and which at the end will help to move things a bit faster. Remember that this is a very slow process. There are a lot of requirements. You will see the requirement just to get consideration of your activities, your results, whatever you are doing in the next session. But this is important for you guys to understand. And let me ask you this question: what is the common position? Just to find out where we are. If someone who explain a bit, not much, of this common position from indigenous people. If any, don't feel afraid to. Okay, well, everyone is afraid to speak, but no problem. That's fine. That's fine.
Eduardo?
Yes.
Est-ce que tu pourrais répéter la question? La question n'est pas très claire. C'est ce que l'on voit dans le chat.
I always highlighting 3 questions that we always have to ask to ourselves. The first question that we always need to know is where we are regarding to the topic that I'm discussing. The second question is how do we get to a place or define my objectives where I want to go? Once I define my objective, I also need to define how do I get to my objective. Usually we know the second and the third question by suggesting many things. We want to conserve the forest, is what is my main objective. This is the second question. But the most important question to answer is where we are. And it's difficult sometimes to find out that even countries understand where we are. And that is the question that I'm asking, if the indigenous peoples have a common agreement of where they are regarding to any X topic, specifically that we're discussing forest in this case. And that is just in a general way. I mean, we don't have to be very specific, no? Because sometimes, yes, we want to do this, we want to do that, and we would like to go there, but I have no idea where I am. And this is exactly the question that three questions that I always highlight. And sometimes it's very difficult to answer the first one. That was the question. It is an easy but very fundamental question. Well, that's fine if nobody wants to answer anything. But do you get it? Okay, Marianne.
Je peux essayer?
Sure, yes.
Okay. Quand nous prenons les droits d'impact climatique sur les peuples autochtones, sur le droit, et c'est un peuple qui est plus attaché aux ressources naturelles. Du coup, le changement climatique qui bouleverse toutes les ressources naturelles, ça les empêche à eux de vivre convenablement. Et quand je prends ce volet-là, là où je me trouve, il y a le droit des peuples autochtones qui est biaisé. Ce que l'on doit faire déjà, c'est convenir à des accords, enfin, s'entendre avec les gouvernants, bien sûr, et avoir un accord. Par exemple, prendre en compte les savoirs traditionnels de ces peuples-là pour, comment dire, pour, je ne sais pas comment expliquer ça, intention à peu apporter une solution au changement.
Okay. Let me see if I.
Problème des changements climatiques. Et ça, c'est un. La deuxième chose, les enfants, il y a l'éducation. Deuxième considération, les savoirs traditionnels des peuples autochtones. Résume un peu ce que M. Eduardo a dit. C'est l'idée que j'ai.
Lost the sound. Marianne was mute herself. Well, let me just comment quick on what I understood. She's correct. She highlighted using that they need to talk with the government authorities. That is important. Second, that she proves the issue that the authorities will need to understand, this is important, we need to understand the indigenous people. You mentioned this wording exactly, but indigenous people knowledge or capacity that has helped to conserve forests. And I'm bringing the issue to conserve forests because this is exactly what I get as a clear mandate, that we need to recognize that the indigenous people are good in conserving forests. The knowledge that they have in doing it is important. And sometimes this is very difficult to be not accepted, but it's not that the foreigners are not accepted, but to be understood, because they focus themselves most in the activities that are causing emissions and not focusing themselves in the activities that are removing emissions. There are the two different activities here. One's causing emission and other one's causing removals. And those are the things that we need to bring into the attention of the government. Specifically when we're doing our greenhouse gas inventory, because we need to find out where we are really out. Of course, deforestation is happening everywhere in most of our developing countries. We haven't been able to stop completely deforestation, and as a developing country, we're always going to have it. But that doesn't mean that that is the main problem. Maybe I could also support the enhancement of removals, which is exactly what we are fighting at one of these negotiations, that conservation, our standing forest there, which is removing the CO2 emission from atmosphere every day, is accepted, is considered as an activity. And officially is considered as an activity because it's one of the 5 REP+ activities that we are fighting. But that understanding is sometimes very vague, and we get pushed to stop emission from deforestation, but we drive away from analyzing what is my conservation status in the country. It is a good question. I mean, it's a good answer and important to understand. And I have seen many of the baselines for the forest sector, and most of them focus in just emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. This is exactly what I wanted to highlight. If you want to get recognition for the activities that most of you are engaged with, sustainable forest management, conservation, we need to be sure that the country, when the country is presented the information to be evaluated, include those activities. Because at the end, there are external groups that will like to pay for so and will like to help those communities. Of course, there is another mechanism, the sharing benefits, so the benefit sharing mechanisms that needs to be in place. But it's a lot of requirements. I just wanted to start with this discussion because this is exactly what the Paris Agreement talks about. It's a very important agreement, as I mentioned at the beginning. The country's prepares position, prepares activities from bottom to top, not from top to down. And this is important because countries present, we would like to do this, we would like to do that. And we have to be sure that in every submission that the countries present, which is called the National Determined Contribution, the NDCs, your activity was included there. Last 2020 was the second round of the NDCs presentation. And I'm 100% sure, I haven't read them all, but I have read some of the African countries that have forests, and forest was considered there. But the point is, when it's considered, moving to what we need to do to see the results is a different story. Okay, Paris Agreement. This is more or less the topic of today's conversation. Of course, the ambition gap. I'm gonna be honest with you, this is the most official information that we have about the ambition gap. The different NDCs first were called intended national determined contribution, put us on track for a world that is 2.7 to 3.7 degrees Celsius. That sets the basis for the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. We have another round of NDC last 2020, and I believe the gap is still the same according to the most official information. However, we have been engaged in different discussions, and it seems that the gap that were set for the Paris Agreement, which to keep the goals, the objective goal, as we see it later, of 2 Celsius degrees, was requiring to reduce emissions in the order of 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. It's a big number. It is a very big number. But what I'm trying to highlight right now is that the ambitious gap is not 40 gigatons. Some experts are starting to believe, they haven't concluded the analysis, that we need to reduce about 100 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. This is not a good news, but it's a good news for forests. So forests will have to play their role. So, but that's the ambitious gap that we have in the preparation for the Paris Agreement. There is an interesting paragraph of decision 1CP21. This paragraph number 70 notes with concern that the estimated aggregate greenhouse gas emissions level in 2025, the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015 and 2030, resulting from the intended national determined contribution, do not fall within the least cost 2 Celsius scenario. So we are far away. We are far away. And notes that much greater emissions reductions effort will be required in order to hold the increase in the global average temperature to below 2 Celsius degrees or above pre-industrial levels by reducing emissions to 40 gigatons, as I just mentioned. So this number 40 gigatons seems to be moving to 100 gigatons. And that is very, very worrying. But the point here is the activities in the forest sectors will play a very, very important and key role. And that's important to highlight because this triggers part of the discussion that we will have this year in Glasgow. So that's already announced in paragraph 17 of decision 1CP21. I mean, the journey to Paris started, as a fact, it started back in 2005. Yes, 2005. So let's have it from 2012 onward. We have the convention, the UNFCCC, the framework of the convention. We had the Kyoto Protocol track, and the Kyoto Protocol track, the first period of the Kyoto Protocol ended on December 31st of 2012, and it started the second phase that was never achieved, never had so success to be implemented in a way that we see real reductions in January 1st of 2013 and ended, officially has to end on December 31st of 2020, but it just ended last year, December 31st of 2021, due to the discussions that would never agree on the Article 6. So we also have the Valley Action Plan, the Durban Platform, 2015. The Durban Platform actually requests the party that by 2015, we need to have an outcome that has to be implemented in 2020. So from the Durban Platform, or the discussion that we had in Durban, we agree that by 2050, we will have the Paris Agreement, the so-called Paris Agreement, and that has to be implemented by 2020. Of course, back in those times, we didn't know anything about pandemic, the COVID pandemic. No? And the COP13, the Valley Action Plan, has the shared vision for long-term cooperative action. I have the issue of mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, and capacity building. I want to highlight that forest is part of the mitigation. The forest sector is included in mitigation discussion. However, the discussion of the forest as per RED+ is an activity that works for mitigation as well as for adaptation. See, this is one of the unique sectors that do both activities, and now that is taking more knowledge of parties that, well, yes, we care about adaptation, we care about mitigation, and forest sector is one of them that is bringing those two results in this negotiation. So the road to Paris, as I say, started in 2005, we went all the way. We have many COPs discussing this, discussing that. The Doha, the COP18, the Doha Climate Gateway, as we call it. Actually, that was the amendment of the Kyoto Protocol in 2012. So it officially gave the protocol a second phase period. As I said, ended officially last year. The COP20, the Lima call for climate action. I want to highlight on the COP20 before Paris. Two things that I want to highlight. COP19, the COP in Warsaw. The COP in Warsaw was a successful COP for forests. It's when we conclude most of the technical discussions regarding how we were going to measure, report, and verify the forest sectors when countries were implementing the RED+ scheme, the RED+ activities. It's a set of 9 decisions supported by many other decisions that we had as a discussion in previous COP. But that was one of the main outcomes of the COP in Warsaw, the famous Warsaw RED+ frame. We conclude the discussion there. Then in COP20, in order to make everything more transparent, we create what is called the RED+ Information Hub, which is, this is a link in the webpage of the Secretariat that describes all the activities that every country is doing following all the RED+ decisions. Everything that was agreed under the RED+ Warsaw framework, which gives you the guidance that you need to implement RED+ activity. You have to post it in the convention webpage, which is in the RED+ Information Hub. You text in your computer RED+ Information Hub, UNFCCC, it immediately will address you to this link, and you will find out all the information that your country is officially presenting before the convention in order to receive payments for the results that they have achieved. It's a process. Only, I believe, about 9 countries have officially posted results. But anyway, that was also important for the transparency of the analysis of the forest sector. COP21 is when we have this famous Paris Agreement. In COP22, we have the COP in Marrakesh. And that was very interesting because in the following year, the Paris Agreement was officially ratified. I mean, the countries back in 2016, April 2016, the UN Secretary called for a meeting in New York, and he gets the ratification by many developing and developed countries to ratify the approval to ratify the Paris Agreement. And that was achieved very quick. The Kyoto Protocol took several years. It was adopted in 1997, and it wasn't ratified until 2005. So in the case of the Paris Agreement, it happened immediately. And that was also the year that United States expressed its interest to drop off of the Paris Agreement. It happened, but they returned again. So, I mean, we always will have COPs every year. It's not something that will end because we always will have more information about the issues of climate change, more clarity, more decisions, way to do this, way to do that, and that will always happen every year until parties decide not to have it. But it's very difficult or very impossible that parties decide not to have more of this discussion. As a fact, I don't want to call it fashion, but this is becoming very fashion more and more in many of our developing countries. 20 years ago, I was one of the only crazy guys, at least in my country, talking about climate change. Now everyone is talking about that. The decision 1 CP17, the Durban platform, as I say, also decides to launch a process to develop protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. I highlight a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. I'm not a lawyer, but according to many lawyers, this is not a legal force agreement, the Paris Agreement. Other ones believe it is an official mandate that parties should fulfill and implement it. So that's another discussion over there. But if we bring this decision, and many of the developing countries negotiators bring us into the discussion, I mean, that was decided back in 2011. So we demand developed countries to take the lead, and of course, to provide the financial sources that we need to implement activities that we are presenting. That was already decided, and this is a very strong discussion, very difficult one. It's a financial discussion. But anyway, and also decides that the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform for enhanced action shall complete its work as early as possible, but no later than 2050. We accomplished this objective. We had the Paris Agreement. So, and for it come into effect and be implemented from 2020. But in 2022, and many of these decisions are linked to the decisions related to finance. Finance, as I mentioned before, is still not there. We agree, and which is not enough, to have at least 100,000 of US dollar every year beginning in 2020. We only have achieved 10,000, and getting access to those funds is still a nightmare. It's not very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but country has to go through a very long process, which at the end, countries, developing countries, are competing each other just to get to this point. But anyway, those decisions were agreed back in 2011. And of course, the objective that we want of the Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including by, I want to highlight before I read the text under A, context of sustainable development. Remember that back in 2015, we also adopted the new Sustainable Development Goals, 17 objectives that covers a lot of things. And one of them, number 13, is climate change. But then climate change, the Convention of Climate Change is also bringing the attention of all sustainable development goals, even though it doesn't state it very clear, but developing countries negotiators always highlight that. And you could read the 17 objectives of the Convention of the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a lot of things that are happening there. I want to highlight that the REP+, the Warsaw REP+ framework almost covered all of them. I'm not saying all of them, but almost covered all of them. It took everything into consideration. So the idea was to holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 Celsius, or to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 Celsius. Two numbers there, 2 Celsius and 1.5 Celsius. The 2 Celsius target was a target supported by all developed countries. The 1.5 Celsius was a target supported by almost all the developing countries. And it was very difficult to get an understanding or an agreement about which target we were going to set. Of course, the difference between 2 Celsius and 1.5 Celsius for the developed countries, it was a financial issue. It was a financial discussion because that means more funds to developing countries coming from them, or more sources that most of them are coming from the developed countries, which are the ones who are responsible for the climate change crisis of the global warming that we are having right now. And of course, the 1.5 Celsius is the reality that most of our developing countries are experiencing right now. I mean, temperature is moving upward, and we are now noticing the effects of climate change in many ways in our country. So that was a strong discussion that we didn't get agreement to the last date of the discussion, maybe last Friday night, the last Friday or Saturday. So that was very contentious issue that we were having. The negotiators were discussing that. The idea is to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impact of climate change and forest climate resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development. Ability to adapt. As I mentioned before, one sector that has the ability to mitigate and to adapt is the forest sector. Of course, if we halt deforestation or forest degradation, we become less vulnerable. If we halt it completely, or we will be able to adapt ourselves and to create some kind of resilience process back to where we would like to be. But it's impossible to adapt to something that I don't know how far it's going to go. I mean, emissions are still increasing, as I mentioned before, and adapting to something that, well, I will adapt to this scenario because emissions will get to this point. No, but the emissions are continuously increasing and increasing. My adaptations measures won't be effective. So we need to have the balance between emissions, where are they getting, to be in the position to decide what will be my measurements to adapt myself, no? Or to become less vulnerable. Making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. It's a very, very interesting sentence. There's a lot of things behind this sentence. Making finance flows consistent. First of all, the finance flows are not consistent at all towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And the reason of doing the exercise, I was asking you at the beginning of this session of what do you believe of where we are right now, the three questions that I raised, where we are, where do we want to go, and how do we get to where I want to go, is relating to this, these paragraphs of the C of Article 2. This is the objective. Making finance flows consistent with a pathway. And look why this is very important. Towards low greenhouse gas emissions. And I have seen many of the NDCs, national determined contributions that countries are presenting, trying to engage in a low greenhouse gas emission strategy without really understanding where we are, projecting or increasing ambitions for 2030 and to 2050. unfortunately, the source of our information that we are presenting on the different greenhouse gas inventory, lack of transparency, lack of robust information, lack of consistency. It's very difficult to compare between one and the other one. So how can we really make a projection up to 2030 or even longer, up to 2050, how we are engaging with many different sectors of our economy without having transparency or robust activity data of that specific sector? That's what I was asking to you guys, where we are. In the majority of our developing countries, we have no idea where we are. So they are presenting, authorities are presenting this low greenhouse gas emissions trajectory without really having enough information. I'm really worried for so, and because at the end, we are actually putting the rope in our throat ourselves. Because once you commit to do whatever you are committing on behalf of your country, in principle, it happens even though this is not a legal binding agreement, you're gonna have to commit yourself with so. So I have been working with some countries within this region, and some other colleagues that are also working in the African region, try to align, at least in the forest sectors, the information that does not commit to a point the developing countries in implementing activities that they will never achieve. And it's gonna become very difficult in the future. What we are trying to do is to create enough information for decision makers to make the best decision. And that's one of the points that we need to understand very well before committing ourselves in something that we don't even know. And believe me that this is happening almost many of our developing countries. Why is the reason? I don't know, sometimes influenced by external consultant. I am an external consultant, I cannot deny so. But I always go to content and try to explain very well to decisions makers, tell them, listen, I mean, you are committing too much. I've been reading a lot about these countries. I don't think the country is ready to do so. Yes, you put in everything conditional, even if you get all the funds on time, you will never achieve those targets. But you have to come from the bottom of the issue and start telling and analyzing your information is not strong enough. So you need to build a data that allows you to put some strategies together. You have plans? Yes, as I say. The second question, yeah, I would like to go there or to achieve this target. Yes, but you don't know exactly where you are. I mean, and that's to me a very important key point that I was asking you. I was also asking to the Mesoamerican group, asking them, okay, what is your common position? Where you are right now? What is exactly where you would like to go? You know, well, conservation is important. Yes, it's key. It's very important for us. But where you are right now, you don't know exactly where you are, specifically because countries are presenting the baseline to analyze the forest, and they are leaving now the conservation issues. So that is important to be included. This is a key activity for you guys. So, which actually helps in getting financial flows consistent. So I'm just explaining the paragraph 2C of the article 2, which is very important and for everyone to understand. Lawrence, it's almost an hour. I don't know if you want to make the first break of 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Oui, on peut faire une pause de 5 minutes.
Okay, I will continue. Article 3. As national determined contributions to the global response to climate change, all parties are to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts. Ambitious efforts. It's an important language. As defined in Article 4, we will see Article 4 talks about NDC mitigation. Article 7 talks about adaptations. Article 9 talks about financial flows. Article 10, if I'm not mistaken, is loss and damage, and 11 is technology transfer, and 13, the transparency of the information everywhere. I mean, flows, financial flows, your activities, everywhere. With a view to achieving the purpose of this agreement as set out in Article 2. Notice one important point that I like to highlight, and while we were discussing a lot about the inclusion of the forest into the Paris Agreement to highlight this sector, which is the only sector highlighted in the Paris Agreement. This Article 3 excludes Article 5. Like, I don't know if that was a failure from our side. I don't believe so, because at the end, Article 5 is part of the Paris Agreement. But you know, the language here is strong. As NDCs to the global response to climate change, all parties are to undertake and communicate ambitious effort as defined in Article 4. But when one ambitious effort is the one defined in Article 5, it is not highlighted here. But then that means that we have to bring it into the Article 4 ambition, which is the mitigation effort. I'm highlighting this because when you have the feeling of the negotiation, nobody really, I mean, I'm not saying nobody. You have the sensation that, well, Article 5 is an article, an isolate article within the Paris Agreement. That is the feeling that most of us are feeling, and we always have to reiterate Article 5 is part of the Paris Agreement, so we have to include it in whatever discussion we are having, blah, blah, blah. This is one point that we always highlight. Hello.
Hey, who is that speaking?
Okay. So with the view achieving the purpose of this Paris Agreement out in Article 2, the target in the objective of Article 2 is 2 Celsius or 1.5. Most of the developing countries are setting 1.5. That was highlighted last year in Glasgow, COP26, that this is now more important to achieve. But we cannot do that without forests. Forests will play an important role. So I just want to highlight one important issue of Article 3 that seems to send a message that, okay, Article 5, perfect, but it's not important because these are the articles that we are concentrating in most of the discussions that are happening there. The compromise in Warsaw, COP 2019, it is Article 5. The Lima COP 20 also highlight that. Submissions well in advance in COP 21, and this is a track to Paris Agreement. At the beginning in 2015, before Paris, the meeting in Paris, we didn't know exactly what we were going to present on our intentions, national determined contribution. I mean, parties express whatever they want to express and send it to the convention. No? the information of every INDC has to be quantifiable information on the reference point or base year. That was missing in many of the INDC, and this is all INDC because we didn't have the Paris Agreement back in that time before, in the year of 2050. The time frames weren't too sure. Some countries put baselines to compare 1990, other ones put 2020, other ones put 2015, other ones didn't put any year. So it was very difficult, but that was information that was agreed before Paris to see if countries could, present something that could be understood by everyone. Planning process, assumptions, and methodological approach, including those for estimating and accounting for anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Estimating and accounting for anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. An important point. It doesn't mention, estimating and accounting for anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission and as appropriate removal, and how the parties consider that in the INDC, it is a fair ambition. Anthropogenic emissions are the ones caused by humans' activities. We all know that. As appropriate removals. The language is vague, is a little bit vague. If removals is referring to anthropogenic removal, it seems to be so, but it's not clear. Of course, conservation is not an activity that is considered as an anthropogenic removal. It's nature removal. And that is the big discussion because most of our developing rainforest countries are fighting that conservation that is happening, the removals that our standing trees are doing as a natural way of doing it, every year, has to be considered. So that's the fact because that's the language that we have in those texts before Paris Agreement. Estimating and accounting for anthropogenic greenhouse gas emission and appropriate removal. Of course, if you read the language of the Warsaw Plus frameworks, conservation, which is a natural activity, is considered. So how we could reconcile between these two interpretations? At the end, it is a financial interpretation, a financial discussion that requires clear interpretation. Most of the developed countries does not want to account for. So when the country is presenting activities related to, that are not additional, that are not done by humans, projects or humans activity. So that's an important thing. But when you really see how it contributes toward achieving the objective of the convention, which is decision 1CP 20 paragraph 4, it brings the issue of removals in general. So that's the text. That's what we have in front of us, and that's what we have to really, have the ability to discuss it and to bring it into a point that is officially accepted, which will trigger financial flows. LDCs, these developed countries and small island development states may communicate information on strategy plans and action for low greenhouse gas emission development, reflecting their special circumstance in the context of INDC. They have a special circumstance. They could be flexible, but sometimes have read information coming from some parties belonging to these two groups that are very, very ambitious, and I don't know how they are planning to achieve when they have a special circumstance, but we always have a special treatment for those specific countries. Article 4. To me, regarding, of course, this is a mitigation article, but this is the core of the Paris Agreement discussion. that's where we have a lot of contentious realities of and discussion and negotiations between parties' position. And most of the time, most of our developing countries are not quite prepared to have this discussion that, in my personal opinion, is going 20 years ahead of what we are doing. Remember the party groups that we discussed in last session? One of the most, or the strongest group to me that goes to this discussion is the European Union. Of course, all developed countries seems to have a common understanding and a goal to bring to the discussion versus developing country or non-annex one, and is brought to this specific article. Article 5, aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gases emission as soon as possible. Yes, so it means that we have to, whatever we want to do, we like to get the peak of our global greenhouse gas emission and then start coming down. Achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removal by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. And here it talks about anthropogenic emissions by source and removals by sinks. But you always have this word anthropogenic emissions. And conservation is not anthropogenic, and that's part of the discussion. Each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive national determined contributions that it intends to achieve. In your NDC, you will present what you are doing, what you will do, and you pretend to achieve. If your country presents that your conservation of forests is removing in a way and another one, that has to be accepted. Remember, the NDCs is a bottom-up approach. It's not a top-down approach. It's also that this is what I'm considering that I'm doing, and conservation is one of them, then it has to be considered. So each party's successive NDC projection before beyond parties' current NDC and reflect its highest possible ambition, reflecting its common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability in the light of the different national circumstances. This is a strong paragraph. It is, especially in the light of the different national circumstances, and of course reflecting its common but differentiated responsibility. This is where we present, well, I could do up to here. This is my commitment before the Paris Agreement. I could do more if I get enough financial flows to do activities. And what I have been seeing or reading in many FNDC, that yes, parties are committing, but all conditional to final flows. At the end, parties are not committing at all in anything. They said that sometimes the parties go to the other way, they're committing in too many things without, I mean, not being conditional to financial flows. So, but the idea is that every 5 years we have to increase the ambition, whatever the ambition will be from the parties. And unfortunately, I haven't read all of them, probably 20% or 30% of the NDC of some developing countries. I don't see a comparison of the first NDC with, or the 2015 NDCs with the 2020 NDC. So we set some goals in 2015, and then in 2020, we set the different goals and claiming that was more ambitious. I mean, you should have, as I say, a progression of your NDCs. And that is missing many of the NDCs that we are having. Just take this as a homework for you guys. Read the first NDC and read the second NDC of the country, the one in 2015 and the one in 2020, and see if there is a link or comparison between the first one and the second one. I don't see many countries really did that work. So that is important. Developed countries parties should continue taking the lead. Of course, this also engaged them in the financial discussion, because they are the ones that have to provide the financial sources to implement whatever we want to implement. We all agree on the Paris Agreement that we all have to have some commitments. Countries decide what kind of commitments we would like to have. And of course, the commitments depends obviously in financial flows getting into our country. And as I explained before, unfortunately, the Green Climate Fund is only operated to a 10% of the funds pledges that were promised back in 2010, because we had this discussion in Cancun in 2010. Support shall be provided to developing countries parties. It's important. Yeah, there are some financial flows that are going to create capacity to developing countries. And I will, as we are doing for RED+, I will also advise parties to do it for the other sectors. I mean, the RED+ sector has everything that needs to have in place in order to present results. Agreements on time frame is important, and that is a political decision. Sometimes I always advise, well, the Paris Agreement is in 2015. Most of the NDCs are setting base years in 2015. Is you going to present information for the forest sector, well presented at least in line with the Paris Agreement. The NDC has to be updated every 5 years. Well, it's very difficult to project the future, but then present your baseline up to 2015, valid for the following 5 years, then do a different baseline up to 2020 and present it valid for the next 5 years, running from 2021 to 2025. That is missing. That is missing, and it's very difficult. I was once a decision maker in my country, and it was very difficult to understand when I have information from 2013 or from 2007. And which is the baseline? Which year? So how do I know that I'm doing correct? If you're presenting information in a different way that is difficult for me to follow. So we need to have clarity in the way that we are presenting the information, specifically for decision makers, that they don't understand much of what this climate change convention is discussing. They have other more important problems back at home. And the technical groups are the ones that have to give it the most accurate information. Of course, you are indigenous peoples groups. You also will bring your indigenous people knowledge into this discussion, but you also need to understand the scientific rationale behind to enhance your knowledge value in terms of ton of CO2 equivalent. Nobody discussed that you are not protecting, conserving, and fighting against deforestation and forest degradation all worldwide. But sometimes we need to understand the meaning of your activities, what you are really contributing with your knowledge in terms of ton of CO2 equivalents that helps whatever the country is trying to achieve. And we will have that in the next session. I will bring someone, an expert that we train, that will guide you to the whole process in how to get that information. Support shall be provided to developing country parties, as I mentioned, and this information, 4.8, every 5 years, is the paragraph 9, common time frame, that's what I was discussing, is paragraph 10. Adjustments, you could do adjustment to the NDC, and this is key, because it doesn't matter that the countries present and you were not considered whatever you brought to the discussion of the NDC, or you probably brought it too late. You could bring adjustment, the NDC could be adjusted according to any new findings that the country has achieved during or after they presented the NDC. And then, of course, it goes to a public registry. Public registry, I will just show you in a minute where all the NDCs are. So it's not a secret, it's public. You will review your country's NDC. and find out if your issues are there. This is important. This is a starting point in you guys. I don't know how many of you have reviewed the NDC or have participated in the discussion of the NDC. In principle, is happening under the national consultation process. I don't know if that is true or false everywhere. Sometimes I believe that that national consultation is very difficult to understand because authorities are bringing a language that nobody understands. Although sometimes I believe they don't even understand what they're discussing. That's what I find out, because it's very complex, very difficult. Accountings is paragraph 13, guidance, regular information to track progress as part of the paragraph 13. How we are doing in the implementation of the NDCs and long-term low greenhouse gas emissions. Let me just show you quick the link where you could look your country's NDC. Let's out of here. Let's show this. Well, let me first show you the Article 4. Article 4. Can you see the Article 4 in your screen? Thank you.
Oui.
Okay, thank you. This is Article 4. I want to show you because the Article 4 is composed by 19 paragraphs. Very important paragraph. I just try to highlight the most important one, but I believe every paragraph is important in order to achieve the long-term goal set out in Article 2. Parties aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. When as soon as possible is, I have no idea. Everybody decide when is that. It's probably last year, was last year, maybe this year, maybe in 10 years, I don't know, but this is a country's decision. Each paragraph 2, each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain successive NDC that it intends to achieve. Parties should force a domestic mitigation measure with the aim of achieving the objective of such contribution. What are the domestic mitigation measures that your country is achieving? Is important, supposed to be reflected in your NDC. And here is important, whatever you consider should be included. This is the paragraph that support your wishes or your activities, of course, in a way that makes sense toward achieving the objective Article 2, which is the 2 Celsius degree or 1.5. Each party's successive national determined contribution will represent a progression beyond the party's then current national determined contribution and reflect its highest possible ambition, reflecting its common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities in the light of different national systems. I have found myself this paragraph very, very strong and very difficult. Will represent a progression beyond the party's then current national determined contribution. As I mentioned before, I haven't seen a progression of my first NDC back in 2050 with my second NDC in 2020. I have seen in many of the, and I have read the ones within my region, the NDCs within my region, they look like wish lists, honestly. They look like wish lists. I don't think that is the way. I'm not saying every country is presented in that way, but I don't see the connection between the first one and the second one. And when you see the document, it's probably more than 100 pages. And when you see a document coming from a developed country, it's about 20 pages, 25, 30 pages. Ours one, we were coming from a smaller country, has an ambition of 130 something pages. When you read it, it's very confusing. It's very confusing. So we need to have very clarity in whatever we are writing there. And this is still a point that we need to improve when we're doing NDC. And sometimes the language is contradicting. When you read in one side of the text, then later read in another part of the text, and it's a bit contradictory to what you are understanding. So those things, of course, we need to improve them. That's part of the weakness that we have. Of course, as I said, paragraph 4, developed countries should continue taking the lead by undertaking economy-wide. Most of the developed countries could provide information to the whole sector of the economy. We can't yet. It's difficult for us to do it. But now we are falling in this trap that, yes, let's do it for all our economy sector when we don't even have enough activity data to provide robust and transparent information about what we are saying. So we have to be very careful, and I have seen this in many NDCs trying to include all kinds of sectors without having the understanding of the activity data in a transparent way of that specific sector. Support, I talk about support, which is paragraph 5, shall be provided to developing countries by the implementation of these articles in accordance with 9, which is article that talks about finance. 10 and 11 is loss and damage and technology transfer. Don't take it as a fact. Don't take it as a fact, what I'm just going to say, because sometimes some of us believe that a discussion in implementations, activities, or projects regarding to financial flows or regarding to the technology transfers, which is important, of course, excludes forests. And this is a way to, sometimes we believe developing countries need a lot of technology transfers. Now we're talking about electric vehicles, we're implementing renewable energy projects. Of course, most developed countries are the ones providing all that technology to our country, which is very, very welcome. But when we are discussing about forests, specifically tropical forests, developed country cannot provide any expertise in how to keep or conserve or to grow native species, whatever we know much better than them. That creates problem because the transfer of technology regarding to forest is not in the appetite of developed countries because they don't have that expertise to provide it to us. Of course, they could provide information how accurate we could measure by putting all these tools that are available using satellite image, satellite information. That's perfect. But for the implementation, it's something that we know much better. And some of us believe that, of course, this is not a sector that they could provide enough technology to be transferred to our country. That's why they don't pay too much attention. It is a belief. Don't take this as a fact, but some of us believe so. And when you are having a discussion of renewable energy project versus implementation as a forestry or reforestation project, you will see more interest in renewable energy project, which is very, very important. Well, that's paragraph 5. The paragraph 6, the least developed country and small islands, you know, they have a special circumstance. We could be very flexible. Paragraph 7, mitigation of benefits resulting from Paris adaptation actions and or economic diversification plans can contribute to mitigation outcomes under this act. This is what I was highlighting, that the forest sector has the advantage of bringing both benefits. If you conserve or halt deforestation or forest degradation, conserve your forest, you bring in a lot of mitigations or benefits for adaptation actions in our country. This is key. This is key because, as you say, it can contribute to mitigation outcomes under this article. If you want to present any activity within your forest sector as an adaptation perspective, it could also be considered as a mitigation one. That is key. I just want to highlight this because when we are talking about carbon credits, incentive, there is a concept of additionality that you consider this project as a mitigation activity. But then if you don't consider that as a mitigation activity, and it was first considered as adaptation activity or project, then you fail the check of the additionality because it was never considered as a mitigation activity. This paragraph talks very well that at the end can contribute to mitigation outcome under this article. It kills the concept of additionality. And I also want to highlight that the additionality concept was brought to the Kyoto Protocol, to the clean development mechanisms, which are the projects implemented in developing countries that need to have that criteria. Those are probably, I don't know how many of you have done clean development mechanisms projects. But it's a concept that sometimes you have to be very smart to prove the additionality. That project was implemented because you were aiming to combat climate change. From the financial perspective, it's a lot of process that you have to prove in order to meet the additionality criteria of the project. Very difficult, sometimes very difficult. So conservation, according to them, doesn't meet additionality concepts. So that is important, and I highlight this paragraph 7. Paragraph 8, all parties shall provide information necessary for the clarity, transparency, and understanding in accordance to decision 1CP21, which is the decision that has as an annex the Paris Agreement, and any relevant decision of the Conference of Parties. Shall provide information necessary for clarity, transparency, and understanding. I don't think that we still have some weakness in presenting NDCs because the clarity and transparency and understanding is not yet there. I could admit myself that second NDC, or the 2020 NDC, was much clearer than much clearer than the first NDC, but we still need more transparency, and better understanding. And that we still need to work on. So every 5 years has to be communicated. But you could also present your NDC this year or improve your NDC this year. I mean, the target that we have put between every NDC is that every 5 years, this country should present what we are doing, what are our intentions of increasing the ambitions. But if I want to improve my NDC, I could also improve it this year and send a better one. That's an option that all countries have. No? As I say, paragraph 11, a party may at any time adjust its existing NDC with a view to enhancing its level of ambitions in accordance with the guidance of the adopted by the government. That's paragraph 11. I will return just to paragraph 12. National determined communicated contributions to a by party shall be recorded in a public registry maintained by the Secretariat. Let me just show you very quick this public registry. This, well, anyway, there is there is a special place in the web page of the convention that you could look it up. You could look up all the NDC of your country, read it. I don't know how many of you have read the NDC of your country, but you should read it and try to understand. Hopefully you will understand everything, but if you don't understand, try to find out what they are meaning by anything that they wrote there and send to the convention, because it becomes a very important document. Paragraph 70, each party to chapter responsible. Paragraph 19, that's the other one that I want to highlight. All parties should strive to formulate, should strive. No, it doesn't say shall strive, should strive to formulate and communicate long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy, mindful of Article 2, taking into account their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capability in the light of the different national circumstances. I want to highlight the should versus the shall. In negotiation text language, should is encouraging to do it. The shall, when we use the shall, is a more stronger language, it's more like an obligation. But for some reasons, I'm seeing that some parties are considering Article 19 as an official mandate. And I mentioned before, I obviously will encourage every country to do a national, communicate a long-term low greenhouse gases strategy. But it's impossible to build a long-term low greenhouse gases strategy without having robust or transparent activity data. So my recommendation is always start getting the information that you really need in order to build your long-term low emission strategy, because it's impossible to do it without enough with clarity in information. And unfortunately, when we're doing the analysis of other sectors, the information is not clear. What countries are doing? Many of our developing countries are presenting this idea of long-term low greenhouse gas trajectories. And when I have the opportunity to review some of them, and unfortunately it's not connected as another point. If you have worked in the country that have robust and information here, I have had the chance to do it in three or four countries about looking the forest sector information as required by the Article 5 and seeing the information that this group of consultants are bringing as part of the long-term low greenhouse gas emission strategy. They use different information. And my question to them is why did they use the same information that was already prepared for the country? I never get a clear answer, honestly. But that is happening. That is happening. Maybe there is a time gap between the way that they start the consultancy and when they have to finish. But this is one question. Then when I also have a lot of expertise in the energy sector, especially in energy generation sector. And when I see the way that they present this strategy and whatever emissions are coming from the energy sector, I go to this country and ask them, the energy sector groups, if they understand what they are presenting here. And it's 100% answer. No, we haven't. We just see they do whatever they do. They do their own estimation. They present things that, okay, it's a bunch of numbers that we have no idea. Well, why you are accepting something that you are not understanding or you do not understand the rationale behind that. This is key. This is key. And this is also an important point that I want to highlight to you guys, because whatever the countries are presenting in the NDC, that's why you need to read the NDC, has to be understood by you guys too. By you specifically in the issues related to forest that of your concern. So I just wanted to highlight that point, because this is happening, I would say, in many of our developing countries, and encourages by the paragraph 19 of Article 4. Funds are provided to developing countries, and they immediately goes to bid who is going to do the consultancy, and that at the end creates a lot of confusion. So, any question about Article 4, sorry? It's an important article regarding to forest. Because here in Article 4 is where we have to really present. Remember that Article 3 doesn't mention at all Article 5, which is the one that we will see in a minute. And Article 4 is the one that we have to include everything that is in the Article 5. Article 5, the ones related to forest. It was a very contentious article that we discussed in Paris. Friday, I would say Saturday morning, we were still discussing the inclusion of this article into the Paris Agreement text. There were some strong opposition from developed countries, that didn't agree to this article. The idea that, or the objective that we wanted is that if we didn't include it, the forest sector was going to be diluted completely with other sectors that doesn't have the same rules that doesn't have any root at all, that we have already agreed on the Warsaw Plus framework in COP 19 in 2030. That was our fear. And it was very good because all the rainforest nations got the consensus that the Paris Agreement has to reflect an article recognizing what we have agreed in Warsaw. We got common consensus among ourselves. We were fighting very strong, and I remember very well our leaders fighting for so too, expressing strongly that forest has to be there. And we get it. And we got 2 paragraphs on the Article 5. Let me get the paragraph instead of this. Parties should take actions to conserve and enhance as appropriate sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases, as refers to in Article 4, paragraph 1b of the Convention, including forests. If you don't understand much of the language of the Paris Agreement of the Convention, this first paragraph was a very contentious paragraph, because this is a paragraph related to developed countries, not to developing countries. But it could be misunderstood, as many times have seen it. Should take action to conserve. Look, to conserve and enhance. Perfect. Getting the agreement into this language was not easy. It took many hours to agree in this language, because developed countries didn't want to include conserve. And of course, including conserve triggers the activity of conservation that we have on the REP+. Then the second paragraph, which is the one related to developing country of Rainforest Nation. Parties are encouraged to take actions to implement and support, including through result-based payment, including the existing framework as set out in related guidelines and decisions already agreed under the Convention 4. We were referring to the Warsaw REP+ frameworks. Policy approaches and positive incentive for activities relating to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stock in developing countries. An alternative policy approach such as joint mitigation and adaptation approaches for the integral and sustainable management of forests, while reaffirming the importance of incentivizing as appropriate non-carbon benefits associated with such approaches. If the first paragraph was difficult to be included in this article, the second one was most difficult. Because in the second one, it was also a big discussion amongst developing countries, specifically for the last part of the paragraph 2. While reaffirming the importance of incentivizing as appropriate non-carbon benefits associated with such approaches. This language is linked to the discussion in Article 6. Article 6, most of the discussion of Article 6 is the discussion of carbon market. So it also was brought specifically by Bolivia and the ALBA group. The non-carbon benefits or the non-carbon approach benefits or co-benefits. The Warsaw REP+ framework talks about co-benefits. And we probably will see that in the next session. But getting the agreement of this was triggered. Let me just show you. Was triggered by a decision that we had back in 2010 in the, let's see, where is the Cancun Agreement decisions. I want to show you the Cancun Agreement decision, which is very important for you. In 2010, due to the failure in Copenhagen regarding to forests or regarding to a common understanding how we were going to do the REP+ mechanisms. We had this decision, the Cancun Agreement. We adopted policies, approach, and positive incentives on issues related to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, and the role, I want to highlight again, of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stock in developing countries. It happened in 2010. The discussion was triggered initially in 2005 in Montreal. 2010, halfway to the Paris Agreement, we achieved so, and that's why we wanted to have. We want the Paris Agreement to reflect these policies, approaches, etc. We will see this later, but I want to highlight paragraph 17. Encourage developing countries parties to contribute to the mitigation action in the forest sector by undertaking the following activities. We'll see the 5 REP+ activities. The 5 REP+ activities cover all activities that might happen within a forest. Of course, every activity might mean implementation of different actions into the forest, but it covers everything. And it also decides 4 points to move forward: national strategy, a forest reference level, which is the baseline, a robust and transparent natural forest monitoring system, and a system for providing information on how the safeguard refers to maintain this one for this decision will be added.
Eduardo, excuse-moi.
Yes.
Je crois que le son est un peu faible. Je ne sais pas si tu peux parler un peu plus près du micro,
Okay,
ou si tu veux faire une pause de 5 minutes, vu qu'on a déjà passé 1 heure.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Oui, et nous avons une question aussi.
The mic a bit just to move into the computer. Anyway.
Ok,
Voilà.
on a une question aussi, Eduardo,
Sure.
je vois. De parfait.
Okay. Go ahead.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Bonjour.
Vous allez m'excuser de vous rejoindre un peu avec des difficultés d'électricité. Entre-temps, j'étais avec vous et le courant avait coupé et voilà comment je reviens.
Super, merci pour votre participation. Je pense que l'on peut continuer. Est-ce que, Eduardo, tu veux faire une pause maintenant ou tu veux continuer?
Oh, yes, it's time for a 5-minute break. Times go fast. Yeah, perfect.
Ok.
Okay, 5-minute break.
Merci.
Merci.
Shall we?
Oui, je pense qu'on peut reprendre.
Okay. Okay, let me just conclude a bit of Article 5. That was one of the reasons why we were fighting very hard in Paris to have an article specifically related to all the Red Cross decisions. This is very important for you guys because we will discuss more about Red in our next section. If you read paragraph 72, also request, this is a paragraph 72 from the Cancun Agreement back in 2010. Also request developing country parties when developing and implementing their national strategies or action plans to address inter alia driven deforestation, forest degradation, land tenure issues, forest government issues, gender considerations, and the safeguard identified in paragraph 2 of that appendix of this decision 1CP16, ensuring the full and effective participation of relevant stakeholders, inter alia, indigenous peoples, and local communities. Strong paragraph, and I was reading a chat message in the chat about a country that is not paying too much attention to the was just from John Donald that if possible included the indigenous people, especially in protecting forests. Mitch, bring this paragraph to the attention of wherever this is happening. That the paragraph also requests, and request is a strong word. It's not a should request, also request like a mandate. The participation, the full and effective participation, inter alia, indigenous people and local. That doesn't happen by chance. I'm gonna be very honest. The indigenous people back in that time, they were already on board in these discussions. We brought the indigenous people issues, a very important one. It was established here in the Cancun Agreement decision text. And of course, that was transferred to the Article 5. So I just want to highlight this in the Article 5 discussion. That behind that discussion, there are so many other decisions that are very, very important. But we will continue and discuss that in our next section, which is the Article 5 or the Red Plus requirements, requirement for the implementation, so you understand much better that. So we continue now with the Paris Agreement. So any question up to here under Article 5 up to Article 4, see the importance why to have forest activities within the NDC that has to be introduced as part of Article 4. Your activity of Article 5, it is key. It is very, very important. Any question? Okay. Then Article 6. No, sorry, this is Article 5. Yes, Article 6.
Allô?
Yes.
Allô?
Allô? Question?
Excusez-moi, si vous permettez, est-ce que vous voudrez bien revenir un peu sur l'article, sur le paragraphe 8 et 11 de l'article 4, que je n'ai pas bien suivi, si vous permettez.
Hold a second. Sure.
Merci bien, merci.
Paragraph 8 of Article 4 is the one that we're asking.
Oui, c'est bien ça. Le paragraphe 8 et le 11 aussi. Merci.
Okay. What is the question you want to go and explain again? I will say the following. In communicating the NDC, yes, go ahead.
Non, non, allez-y, allez-y, allez-y. Excusez-moi.
We should go ahead myself. Okay. Okay, the NDC. All parties shall provide the information necessary for clarity, transparency, and understanding in accordance with this decision of any relevant decision serving as the meeting of the party to the party sector. What I highlighted here is that the information that you're presenting in the NDC has to be very clear, has to be very transparent, and has to be understood. I could say that not every sector have enough or robust activity data to present clarity and transparency and a clear understanding of the information that you are providing in the NDC. I have read many NDC. I consider myself that I understand, I have a high degree of understanding what they are trying to present. But when I review the information that they are presenting, it's not clear. Of course, if it's not clear, it's because lack of transparency. And the transparency means where that activity data of that specific sector is coming from. It's coming from many of the greenhouse gas inventory that we have presented before the convention under our different national communication for many years. But when you see the source of getting that information, the activity data, it isn't robust. Nobody, I go and say, where do you get this information? And this is a reality. I have visited countries, say, okay, you have these estimations. Where is the data supporting this information? Unfortunately, most of the answer that I receive is that they don't know where is the data. And that lack of transparency. And of course, that influence in the clarity and much more in the understanding. Because when you read the NDC, you don't understand many of the things that they are writing in the NDC, which are based in activity data that in some way has been used to do estimations of CO2 emissions, blah, blah, blah. And from that, you agree to do some reduction. But why that activity data is not robust of its from? Many of our case is from, it's far from being accurate. So that's what I am highlighting in paragraph 8, that one weakness that most of our NDCs are having is in providing information that is not robust. I cannot comply with this requirement in clarity, transparency, and understanding unless I prepare activity data, collect the activity data in a robust way that helps me to understand. Because remember that at the end, this is going to be translated to tons of CO2 equivalent, a different concept, different unit. I mean, we're talking about, you heard me about, we need to reduce 40 gigatons of CO2 emissions that are in the atmosphere. I don't see anything in the atmosphere, just breathe in the air. So this is difficult to understand. And one important point is that we are failing into a trap in providing ambitions without having a clarity and transparency, and much less understanding on the activity data of the sector. Then if we go to paragraph 13, sorry, paragraph 11, sorry. A party at any time may adjust its existing NDC contribution with a view to enhancing its level of ambition in accordance with guidance adopted by the Conference of the Parties serving as the meeting of the party to the Paris Agreement. Even though that the paragraph above says that every 5 years we have to present NDCs, and of course, if I presented in 2020, but now in this year, I realized that the activity data that I used to present information about a specific sector was not reliable when I present my NDC. I could present again my NDC this year and explain why I'm presenting a new NDC due to new findings or new facts about the specific sector. So I really, let me, how could I express this in a better way? I don't encourage countries to present numbers linked to targets of emissions reductions if they don't have reliable information that could support according to the national reality of the country that this will happen. First of all, predicting the future is impossible. Almost all our developing countries have plans of how we will keep moving, developing our country. Yes, we are planning to do this, we are planning to do that. But unfortunately, those plans, most of the time, are indicative, are not the reality that will happen in the time period that we are setting those plans. So if that is not the case, I never encourage a country to present a clear target of emissions reductions without really understanding the national circumstance. This is, the NDC is becoming a very strong and powerful report or document that countries are presenting before the whole world, because you're presenting this before the conventions. And when you go to UN meetings, New York or wherever they happen, those documents are always going to be brought to the attention of the leaders. And you might have one leader this year, and you might have another leader different year, and the next leader might question why we present this if we weren't too sure. So that's what I'm saying, that paragraph 8 is important to be understood by our authorities. And when you are doing the national consultation within yourself, I mean, it's not about just conserving forests. You will like to know how much are our forests removing, what amount of ton of CO2 equivalent are our forests removing from the atmosphere. This is a key point to understand. And I'm pretty sure you will ask this question to your authorities that they won't have an answer, unfortunately. And of course, they won't have an answer because they have not prepared the activity data in order to answer this important and fundamental question regarding forests. We are not talking about just conservation of forests or about increasing the forest cover of the country, because if I use a definition in one way or change the definition of forest in another way, the forest cover of the country change immediately, but not the emissions or the removals. That's a different story. I hope I have been able to clarify the questions regarding paragraph 8 and 11. So as a complement, I will encourage you to request to your authorities if they know what is the contribution of forest conservation in terms of CO2 removals in the country. it is clear.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci pour toutes ces explications. Merci.
Go back to the Article 6. Article 6 was another article that it was 2 o'clock in the morning on the last date of the COP is a Friday. I remember right now the exact date. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, the Saturday night, and we didn't have Article 6. And Article 6 talks about voluntary cooperation, various approaches, the carbon market component and non-carbon market component. I remember we stayed that night until almost 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to get again, because that was a mandate by ministers and leaders to engage again and see if we could get a common understanding or consensus to have an Article 6 there into this discussion. Voluntary cooperation implementation of NDC. The Article C is an important article from my perspective. Other ones can have a different opinion because it engaged the private sector, the international private sector participation. We cannot rely in governments always providing funds to our developing countries, specifically developed countries. So we needed back in that time to ensure the private sector participation. They were willing to participate with us. So the voluntary cooperation implementation of NDC. This is a voluntary article. You as a country will decide if you want to participate in one of the schemes provided by the Article 6. On a voluntary cooperative approach that involves the use of international transferred mitigation outcomes. A new term introduces into this discussion. I am pretty sure that many of you have already heard the term of certified emissions reductions, which is we call it CERS. Is the language that we use under the Kyoto Protocol. When you are transferring your project generate X amount of CERS, those are transferred to any other jurisdiction that buy the CERS to comply with whatever commitment the Annex 1 country had in that period. But here we didn't want to call it CERS again because that was a language of the Kyoto Protocol. So it ended having this international transfer mitigation outcome language, which is the acronym is called ITMO, that create at the end a lot of confusion after we had it agreed, because it was very difficult to understand what it really means. We finally defined it last year. But yes, perfect. We agree on the Article 6, and we have this towards the implementation of your NDC. It's not toward the implementation of anything outside of your NDC. And that, of course, creates confusion because the preamble of that paragraph brought the concrete discussions of how this ITMO should be considered. And let me just show you the paragraph, which explains it much better for a second. Article 6. The preamble. Parties recognize that some parties choose to pursue voluntary cooperation in the implementation of the NDCs to allow for higher ambition in their mitigation and adaptation actions and to promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. I love this paragraph because this is the discussion that we had over RED+, everything behind the Article 5. For higher ambition in their mitigation and adaptation actions. Remember that I have been highlighting that forest sector perfectly fits mitigation activity as well as adaptation activities. Promote sustainable development and environmental integrity. The terms of environmental integrity or atmospheric integrity is a very important one. It means that if you are showing that you are reducing or removing 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, it means that is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. It's not 50% or 70% or 25%, whatever. The discussion of environmental integrity, as you will see in the next session, took a lot of time to agree. It was a very, very hard and high level of technical discussion among the most experts in the world, I would say. Because we were creating an approach or a baseline, a methodological approach in the forest sector to really prove that whatever outcome you were going to present as a result of your RED+ actions fills the gap of environmental integrity or fills the requirement of environmental integrity. That was very important. And that was expressed in the first part of, or the first paragraph of Article 6. It's a voluntary cooperation in the implementation of the NDC. That's why I remember, I told you before, in Article 3, they didn't mention anything about Article 5. They mentioned Article 4, Article 7, 10, 11, 13. But the Article 6 talks in the preamble text, voluntary cooperation in the implementation of the NDC. It means that if you want to consider RED+ as part of the cooperative approach, which would be a non-carbon or carbon market, it has to be toward your NDC. It means that your Article 5 activity has to be included in your Article 4 activities, or which is your NDC. It's tricky because you have to be very specific, because the first NDCs, the ones presented in 2015, weren't too clear because we didn't know the Paris Agreement. The 2020 NDCs that parties present were clearer than before, not completely for every country, because they don't talk specifically about Article 5 or about RED+, they talk in general about forest. It could be interpreted that is in that way. Second, parties shall were engaging on a voluntary basis in cooperative approach that involved the use of international transfer mitigation outcome, so famous ITMO, towards NDC, promote sustainable development, ensure environmental integrity and transparency, including in governance, and shall apply robust accounting to ensure inter alia the avoidance of double counting consistent with guidance adopted by the conference of the party, serving as the CMP. Another strong paragraph. I want to highlight that the RED+ mechanisms promote sustainable development, as I told you, ensure environmental integrity, and transparency. That was the question raised before about paragraph 8. Clarity, transparency, and understanding. If you cannot show environmental integrity, as I say, a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2. That specific term is related to the way that you collect your activity data. If your activity data collection of information is not clear, is not transparent, then no one will accept environmental integrity. That's what I was telling you, the importance of having clarity and transparency in the activity data, and was against about countries presenting emissions reduction targets without having this information. Because if you read the NDC, also many developing countries, they are relating, this is my ambition, and we also want to participate in carbon market, but specific rules about carbon markets applies. And start with the collection of the activity data. And that's key. And of course, the next point on this shall apply robust accounting to ensure inter alia the avoidance of double counting. Robust accounting. Perfect. Let's assume this very simple mathematical example that I presented. Let's assume that my country decides to have a reduction of 100 tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. That's what I presented on my NDC. But due to the lack of clarity and transparency and understanding, specifically in my activity data, if I decide, which many of our developing countries decided to, even though this is voluntary, if I decide to sell or to transfer to a different jurisdiction of my country, an ITMO, international, the International Transfer Mitigation Outcome, that has to be discounted of my targets that I have written as an ambition of my country. Let's put it in this way, in a very simple mathematical way. My target was 100 tons. I will reduce 100 tons in my country. But then I reduce, let's assume that I reduce 20 so far, but I decide to transfer those to a different jurisdiction. My target was 100. I already reduced 20. So far, internally in my country, I still have to go for 80 more. But then I decide to transfer it to another jurisdiction. Of course, that does not belong to me anymore. That belongs to a different jurisdiction. So the 100 ton of CO2 target that I had, now due to that I transfer 20, it means that I have to increase it to my, I have to increase 20 additional. So I have to look for 20 more additional mitigation actions within the country, that instead of having 80 already achieved, or 80 left to achieve, then I have to achieve 120 because I transferred 20. I just want to see if you follow the mathematics behind this, because this is very confusing for many of our decision makers in our developing countries. This is exactly what we mean avoidance of double counting. I cannot count for those emissions reductions that happen in my country that I transfer to a different jurisdiction because they already belong to a different jurisdiction. So I have to see how I comply with those reductions according to what I wrote in my NDC. If this is understood, this is a very fundamental point to be understood. Please let me know. And this is one of the reasons that we have to be very careful what we write in the NDC. Because most of the time what we are writing in NDC does not represent the best activity data. The data is, data lack of transparency or robustness. We don't have a baseline. And that creates a lot of problems. Yes, we want to participate in the carbon market. We're so happy that we have at least much better understanding of the rule book of the Article 6. But then if you start reading the NDCs, then I don't see how some of the developing countries will ever participate in the carbon market. due to this requirement of double counting. That is called the famous corresponding adjustment. You have to adjust what you have sold. Question, please, Benny. No question. I hope you guys have understood well this concept. And paragraph 3, the use of ITMOS to achieve NDCs under this agreement shall be voluntary and authorized by participating parties. Two parties get agreement between themselves and they agree how they are going to connect. Important key point here to highlight is that the Article 5 or REP Plus have everything that we need to discuss. Promote sustainable development, environmental integrity, co-benefits, everything that are still under the discussion for other sectors has been already agreed on the REP Plus, which is the REP Plus the Warsaw REP Plus framework. So many of our developing rainforest countries are convinced that the Article 5 meets these requirements of the first 3 paragraphs, because this Article 5 was divided in 3 sections. The 6.2, Article 6, paragraph 2 section, the Article 6, paragraph 4 section, and the Article 6, paragraph 8 section. The big difference between them is the section of paragraph 4 deals directly with what we had understood in the Kyoto Protocol approach. It's a project by project approach. It's open, of course, it's open to any country should decide what they would like to do. If they want to implement a project here, the renewable energy project there, whatever. But that's the difference between 6.4 and the discussion under 6.2. The big deal, and the big deal here, or the big challenge, let's put it that way, the big challenge of 6.4 is that you might implement any project under within your country, but then you have to go under 6.2 to request the letter of authorization to transfer that possible results of your project. That is creating a lot of confusion right now, because the REP Plus mechanism is a national approach. It's not a project by project based approach. It has been proven that the national approach, where you focus yourself in everything that is happening within the country, allows you much better to realize what is happening here, there, everywhere. It allows you to see where your hotspots of deforestation and forest degradations are happening versus your green spots of conservations are happening too. At the end, the countries will need benefit sharing mechanisms that will contribute to whatever incomes you might receive of the country's result, benefit whoever is doing things in the correct way. And that's important to understand, because the rationale behind that, and this is something that we are also fighting, is that we want to benefit groups that are really doing things in the correct way. We don't want to create perverse incentives that you will definitely benefit the ones that were deforested and forest or doing degradation in the forest, while other ones were doing conservation for many years. But since that the rules of the project-based approach seems to benefit those that were doing deforestation, creating emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and not to the ones that are creating removal from forest conservation. I hope you understand these key concepts, because that's the big difference between what we have discussed 6.2, which include the first 3 paragraphs of the Article 6, that Article 5 fits perfectly and is ready to present ITMOs from a country, whatever the results are, because you have to demonstrate the results and get a better price for the ITMOs credits. Every ITMO will be a ton of CO2 equivalent to that is meeting environmental integrity. The big discussion behind this was also that the other sector didn't have anything except REDD+. And of course, there was opposition, a strong opposition, and sometimes I couldn't understand a strong opposition by some developing countries. I'm not saying the African ones, but some groups in Africa were not too clear in considering the REPALEAC mechanism of Article 5 into 6.2. That creates a lot of discussion last year in Glasgow. But this is very important for you to understand, especially for IPLCs, indigenous people and forest local communities. Because that's the way you could, in my opinion, personal opinion, get some benefits of your actions in the field. So Article 6.4, sorry, talks about that. It creates a new supervisory body to see those projects that will be considered as part of the activities under 6.4 that might generate some ITMOs. And the other important point that I also want to highlight that might be of your interest, Paris recognized is paragraph 8, which is the 6.8 discussion. Paris recognized the importance of integrate, holistic and balanced non-market approach being available to parties to assist in the implementation of the NDCs in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication in a coordinated and effective manner, including through inter alia, mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer, and capacity building as appropriate. Sometimes I believe this is an indigenous people's position. Sometimes. At other times, I don't believe so. And the reason why I get different message is because from this perspective, you are fighting, not you, because it's the country's negotiation. This is a strong position brought by Bolivia and is supported by some other countries, specifically the ALBA countries, also Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, some small developing island, Dominica, if I'm mistaken. I have visited some of these countries, and when you talk with authorities, they agree that they want to go and get benefit of all the activities, get benefit from carbon markets, all REDD+ activity. But when I hear the positions in the negotiation, I hear the opposite. And the big problem here is that we need to understand the finance that is happening behind this. The developed countries are resistant to provide more finance to anything. Every time that they hear a new agenda item, they don't want to, because that at the end is going to be translated into more finance. The reality is that the Green Climate Fund has not achieved the target of the 100,000 millions per year since 2020. So we believe that the private sector has a role to play, and they want to play their role. And as a fact, I've been participating in some high-level meetings, and when I mean high-level, with the private sector. And there is a strong interest by the private sectors to benefit countries with a much better price that the Green Climate Fund used to pay, which was just $5 tons for CO2 equivalent, that the World Bank is willing to pay to the country, which is also $5 ton of CO2, $5 per ton of CO2 equivalent, that this coalition of low emissions to reduce emissions from the forest sector, the so-called LEAF coalition, which is willing to pay, which is only $10 per ton of CO2 equivalent. There are private sectors that want to pay much more than that. And we are getting offered to pay up to $16 per ton of CO2 equivalent. The challenge that happens in your country, how's going to be the benefit sharing mechanism? And you will need to be sure that you are included. That's something that you need to understand when I asked at the beginning of today's session where we are. And those are the questions that you need to ask your government. First of all, agree among yourselves before moving into this discussion. But this is happening at the same time. There are so many things happening at the same time that it's impossible for you guys to follow up. Or this is part of my work. This is what I'm transmitting to you as part of the capacity building. But you need to understand that this is very perfect. This applies perfectly, in my opinion, to your demands, to your requirement. At least I have discussed this with some of your representatives at these negotiations when it happens at the COPs, and they agree. Of course, as I mentioned last session, the NGOs, indigenous organizations, or other organizations are not negotiators, are not participating in the final decisions. You could speak with negotiations in the corridor, but that doesn't mean that your points will be brought into the discussion. So as a recommendation, I will always say, please ask your government's authority what is the status of the RED Plus activities of possible negotiation if conservation is included. Yes, if they want to receive any compensation, the compensation has to meet the Article 5 requirements regarding the forest, which at the same time we are fighting to be, so that those requirements are considered under Article 6. So far, at this point, even though that the Article 6 outcome of last year does not consider yet conservation, we are convinced that under the discussion on the first 3 paragraphs of the Article 6 and the outcome, it is considered. That's an important point to highlight. Let me just go back again to the presentation. And I'm highlighting this because these are important points for you guys to understand. Article 7, parties establish a global goal on adaptation. Again, the forest sectors deals with mitigation and adaptation. What I really worries me that in Article 4, there was a paragraph that parties should enhance the ambitions in mitigation and adaptation. I mean, the adaptation is very costly, so I really don't encourage parties to enhance ambition in adaptation action unless you are not secure of the funds that you might get. Of course, we need to adapt, and this is very, very important. And as a fact, the adaptation funds, with some of the discussion, some of the sources for adaptation funds came from the discussion in Article 6. I didn't go over that because that's very tricky. Personally, I didn't agree on so because at the end, developing countries were paying by themselves the adaptation process for something that we never caused. So what is important. I don't want to highlight. I don't want to allow it. Sorry, I don't want to leave out highlighting that adaptation is a key element. This article talks about adaptation. Each party shall engage in adaptation planning process and implementation of action. Again, it's very difficult to get these adaptation plans going due to the lack of information that we have in our country. But it's important that we start doing. What the good thing is that the forest sector apply for mitigation and adaptation. And each party should submit an update periodically in adaptation communication, which might include its priority, implementation, and support needs. It's important. Maybe from your perspective, you need also to understand what are your needs, what is really happening, how the weather has changed that is affecting you. Maybe it's affecting you from the agriculture sector perspective or from others possible activity. So Article 7 deals with adaptation. Article 8, loss and damage, to me is very similar to adaptation, but in a stronger way. Parties recognize the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effect of climate change. Of course, this is well linked to, for example, natural disaster caused by climate change, which is in the case of many areas in the world, the intensification of hurricane or typhoons into our areas, which 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe we, at least in the Caribbean region, we have about 3 or 4 hurricanes, also intensive. Now we have 7, 8 hurricanes per season, and it's affecting a lot. And a couple of years ago, 2 hurricanes affected Central American region, both one followed by the other one within 1 week interval. I never remember experiencing that. And in the case of Panama, which is a country that used to call itself free of hurricane, it really affects our west side of the country. So those are part of the loss and damage. But this discussion is important to be understood, because you have to raise with enough and clear information, again, the issue of having a clarity and transparency and understanding of information in order to discuss this article or whatever the text of discussion. Parties should enhance understanding, action, and support, including through the Warsaw International Mechanism on a cooperative and facility basis with respect to loss and damage associated with the adverse effect of climate change. A difficult and tough discussion. Article 9 is the financial discussion. As you could see in the screen, developed countries parties should continue to take the lead in the mobilized climate finance. We could never agree in the shall. They only agree in the should. And the should is a flexible term. Yes, we should, but I'm not obligated. Of course, there are other texts in the convention that highlight this, but they are always under should, using the should language instead of the shall language. And that's, of course, is the problem, one of the main problems that why we haven't had the 100 billion, the 100,000 million target for financing the Green Climate Fund. The developed country parties shall biennially communicate indicative, quantitative, and qualitative information, and provide transparent and consistent information from the support for developing country parties. This is very confusing because in the Cancun Agreement, we agree to have additional funds to what we are receiving for the all other existing funds, like the global environmental funds. But developed countries are saying, no, that's part of my contribution. I'm bringing it to the global environmental fund, or I'll bring it to a different program. That's part of my contribution. So we have this still discussion about the additionality of the fund for the Paris Agreement, or for the Green Climate Fund Agreement, or the Paris Agreement. This is important because right now the developing country wants to bring everything into the Green Climate Fund, and in a way, in another one, dilute the support that they are having to different activities. That is creating also confusion for developing countries. And of course, this is, I mean, the COPA at Morocco, that was COP 2022, create some modalities and procedure for guidance on the transparency of the support, which is the Article 13 discussion. How are we really receiving supports? But the point is, if you are receiving or not receiving, the point is not the important point. Is that if that support is being very effective, I question that too. I question that. So this is an important article. This is the decision itself, highlight the finance. Paragraph 54 of the decision, developed countries intend to continue their existing collective mobilization goal to 2025 in the context of the meaningful mitigation action and transparency on the implementation. Prior to 2025, the Conference of the Paris Agreement shall set a new collective quantified goal from a floor of US 100 billion per year, taking into account the needs and priority of developing countries. It is twisted. The goal of the Cancun Agreement versus the paragraph 54 decision. But at the end, prior to 2025 is where they are supporting themselves. That's why they haven't get the 100 billion or 100,000 millions per year target. Right. Article 9, 10, and 11 talks about technology transfers, capacity building. It's important. This is also related to finance. Capacity building is a key component. I mean, if we don't understand very well what are we discussing, which implies that we understand the Paris Agreement, we understand our needs as part of the capacity building, it's going to be very difficult to implement activities. Of course, we will always get information and create the dialogues between what we would like to do and implement activities, but this is important. Sometimes we lack of understanding, and again, this is related to paragraph 8, article 4 of what we really want to do. That's key. So that is related in article 10, transfer of technology. It's key for our country, but we have to be transferred in a way that is also easy to implement by our country. If it's too expensive, yes, it happens and it will die after the project finishes. That's the reality. Article 13, that's another important article. To me, this is where we report everything. Enhance transparency framework for action and support established. Build on enhance the transparency arrangement under the convention. Purpose of transparency of action. Provide a clear understanding of climate change actions, including clarity and tracking of progress toward achieving parties INDC. This is a key element of Article 13, which is related to the question raised about paragraph 8 in Article 4. The idea of this article is that we know where the support is coming. We know how the support is being implemented and how effective it has been. It reports your actions where you are, because you have to report your greenhouse gas inventory every 2 years of your activity. It reports everything, whatever is happening in the country. Your adaptation needs, your adaptation implementation. So that's a key, and to me, a very important article that is there to provide clarity, specifically also in your actions, also in the amount of financial flows that has gone through our country. In many cases, for the transparency of the information that you have provided, we spoke about environmental integrity. is a key point because all your outcomes are going to be reviewed by a technical expert group under the convention. So it's key that this technical expert group will come back to you with recommendations to improve whatever you are presenting to be reviewed. But they only review results or your baseline. They don't review the financial flows, and that's another discussion. But that's what I was highlighting a lot in the way that we collect activity data. It's Article 13. I will stop
Eduardo?
here. Yes, let me stop in this one, Article 14. Oh, there is a question.
Ah, ok, super. C'était pour savoir si tu vérifiais bien l'heure. Non, c'est bon. Merci.
Yeah. The stock taking. Next year, we will have the first global stock take, and it will start happening every 5 years. The stock take is actually the reviewing of everything that we have said we were going to do in our NDC. Of course, we have no idea how this stock take will happen next year. I'm pretty sure it will be very flexible, and we'll finally, we all agree in guidance in how we are going to present the information for the next stock taking, which will happen in 2028. We are agreeing in how to present the NDCs. Yes, we are improving. We still have some gaps in order to have the clarity, the transparency, and the understanding of the information that we are presenting in our NDC. The stock taking will finally let us know, listen, this is where we are. This is what you are presenting, you will do. It looks like the mitigation activity is driving us to maybe 4 or 5 Celsius degree scenario, or who knows, maybe under 2 degrees scenario, which I really don't. But that is an important article, and hopefully, I don't want to be too optimistic, but I don't think next year we will realize that our action has not been enough at all. That will happen next year. And next year is another opportunity to ask our country's decision makers probably to include activities that were not included in the forest sector. And I'm highlighting again the forest sector, not because this is a conversation of forest with you guys, it's because it's the only sector that has all the rules set under the Paris Agreement, and we are ready to implement. So far, many countries are implementing REP+ activities. Sometimes we get very confused when there are project-based approach activities from different standards that are not recognized by the Article 13 reviewing process. And at the end, I will conclude that so far up to now, the REP+ mechanisms has brought as a result the reduction of emissions close to 1,000 millions of tons of CO2 equivalents to the atmosphere versus what the voluntary carbon standard approaches using projects has brought, which is around 200, a bit more than 200 million of tons of CO2 equivalent. It's a big difference. And of course, we haven't been compensated so far for all that amount of work that what we have achieved. I want to stop here. Sorry, it's 10 minutes after 10. Any final question?
Oui, parfait.
Merci et toutes nos félicitations à Laurence et surtout à la grande présentation claire et nette d'Eduardo. Je voulais simplement faire un petit commentaire sur peut-être les informations que vous n'avez pas pour l'Afrique. Quand j'ai suivi, c'est comme si l'Afrique, dans le processus d'engagement sur la réduction des émissions des gaz à effet de serre, n'a pas une visibilité. Non. En Afrique, moi, je parlerai plus particulièrement de la zone forestière d'où j'appartiens, qui est l'Afrique centrale, qui représente le deuxième poumon forestier après l'Amazonie. Dans cette grande couverture forestière, l'Afrique centrale regorge 10 pays. Et dans les 10 pays, 5 pays sont pays raides. 5 pays sont pays raides. Et dans ces pays raides, l'implication des populations autochtones a été depuis 2008, pour le cas du Congo-Brazzaville, qui est mon pays, a été inclusive, participative. Mais c'était des politiques dans la préparation. On est sorti de la phase préparatoire. Aujourd'hui, le Congo a bénéficié de son NER programme Sangali-Kuala. Mais les discussions sont encore larges, maintenant dans la deuxième phase de l'investissement et de partage des bénéfices issus de ça. Vous avez vu lors de la COP 26 à Glasgow, les populations autochtones ne parlent pas de deux langages. Nous parlons aujourd'hui d'un seul même langage et nous sommes regroupés. Et ce qui a même abouti que dans l'engagement des bailleurs, sur les 1,7 milliard prévus, nous nous sommes organisés pour dire comment les populations autochtones vont être bénéficiaires autour de ces financements lors de son partage. Voilà, je vous partage une petite expérience. Il y a eu la mise en place d'une alliance globale internationale qui regroupe nos frères de l'Amérique latine et le REPALEAC, qui est le réseau des populations autochtones d'Afrique centrale. Un partenariat venait d'être signé à Brazzaville du 21 au 20 au 23 février 2022, où une position commune a été acceptée pour que l'Alliance globale et le REPALEAC commencent déjà à faire les tournées européennes pour faire le suivi et le plaidoyer dans le partage de ces financements. Et du 19 au 23 mars, cette équipe a sillonné, a commencé leur mouvement et ils se sont retrouvés à Londres, rencontrer le ministre de l'Environnement de Londres, qui est le président, le co-chair pour le regroupement des financements, avant son déplacement à Brazzaville. Et nous, ici à Brazzaville, nous avons reçu le ministre de l'Environnement par le rendez-vous du gouvernement. Et nous, en tant que société civile, engagés dans le processus RED et les populations autochtones dans le REPALEAC, on a forcé un rendez-vous spécial pour une journée de la société civile. Et notre position en tant que REPALEAC et populations autochtones, nous avons insisté sur l'appui dans ces financements, sur la reconnaissance de la tenure foncière des peuples autochtones. Parce que toute la clé de la RED+, du développement durable, c'est reconnaître et valoriser les terres et terroirs des populations autochtones. Voilà un peu un partage que je voulais vous dire pour l'Afrique. Donc l'Afrique est engagée dans le processus de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Peut-être qu'il y a des informations manquées. Ma petite deuxième préoccupation, nous saluons l'initiative parce que là, nous partons vers la fin. Je voulais déjà commencer à exprimer mes deux plaidoyers. Le premier, comment le FSC Indigenous Foundation attend-elle de soutenir, nous les bénéficiaires de ces formations, à participer en présentiel dans les COP pour essayer un peu de mettre en application les formations que nous avons bénéficiées, que ce soit un groupe de bénéficiaires de FSC Indigenous qui doit voyager au nom du label de FSC Indigenous Foundation avec des positions pour faire aussi la négociation. Nous prenons déjà l'exemple à l'orée de la COP 27 de l'Égypte. Ça pourrait commencer comme une petite expérience pour renforcer nos capacités et voir si réellement la formation a été notre appropriation. L'initiative n'est pas mauvaise, mais nous voulons matérialiser et devenir des grands négociateurs. Et nous voulons aussi, je vais susciter aussi pour reposer la même question à FSC Foundation, comment pérenniser ces formations après les 3 phases que nous allons faire? Comment la pérenniser pour que ça ne soit pas une formation qui va être dans les tiroirs? Parce que vous savez bien qu'un apprentissage qui n'a pas suivi la mise en œuvre posera problème de la personne qui est bénéficiaire, parce qu'il ne saura comment aller vers quoi. Donc, c'est ce soutien que nous voulons que le FSC Foundation puisse faciliter les Indigenous Peoples dans leur pays, afin que nous commençons aussi à faire le suivi des plaidoyers dans nos pays respectifs, pour qu'on sache que nous sommes dans le groupe des négociateurs pays, au nom des populations autochtones. Voilà un peu les 2 préoccupations et le partage de l'expérience dans le suivi des décisions du Glasgow que les populations autochtones d'Afrique centrale sont en train de mener avec nos frères de l'Amérique latine. Merci.
Je ne sais pas, Eduardo, si tu veux ajouter quelque chose.
It is a very, very important and profound comment, which is happening everywhere. How you are going to interact. I have always been highlighting that, first of all, get a common understanding. Yes, get a common understanding of what are your main objectives. And we're talking in the Paris Agreement about ambitions, but I always talking about, let's be clear and transparent and understanding what we really mean by whatever we mean. So that's one point. First, once you agree, which I believe you have agreed already, then you need to decide who's going to be your country's representative for every country. Because the negotiation starts in your country. But you have to raise the same voice in all the different countries in Africa, the same voice in all the countries in Latin America. So you have a common and strong voice. And believe me, when you have a common and a strong voice, outsiders will listen. And that is important. The experience that I had, I don't know if I shared it with you. I think I shared it last time. You know, I brought myself when I was part of the decision makers in my country. Back in 2008, I brought a chief of one indigenous community here in Panama, two chiefs in one indigenous community in Panama, into this negotiation as part of our negotiator. That was key to me. And that was key to bring the support to get indigenous people consideration into the Cancun Agreement text, as you saw it earlier. But you have to raise your voice in your country. And it's important to have a common position. If you raise one point in one country in Africa, but it's completely different to the one that whoever is raising Latin America, then you create confusion. That's one part. In that way, and I'm pretty sure you will impact the decision makers in your country and every country. Hey, this is happening, they would like to see that. But we need to understand the process, and this is what I'm doing right now, trying to explain the process of the conventions, because as an organization, an external organization or observers, you are allowed to participate in the plenary, you are allowed to participate in the contact group. Sometimes you are allowed to participate into the informal consultation negotiating meetings. But I have never seen you allowed in the informal consultation negotiation meetings, because those are different ones. Unless you are part of the negotiator, of the team of negotiator of your country. But you need to push that. It's a process, something that you have to do. And at the same time, to understand what is your fight in terms of emission reduction or emissions removals, whatever is the case. There are some countries that have done that, not all of them, but there are some countries that have done that, and they are creating bases to start getting the conservation meaning of removing of standing trees that some other ones that would like to pay don't want to pay. That some groups that are some developed countries groups are not willing to accept, so because they are claiming that this is not an issue. We are creating a movement international in order to get this recognition of standing trees, removing CO2 emissions every day. And as I say, was yesterday was a good meeting in London with private sector investors that are willing to engage in that journey. So that's something, but everything starts at home. If you don't do your homework at home, it's very difficult that will happen over there. Of course, I have no idea who's going to be the one representing you. I mean, I'm pretty sure FSC could support you in many aspects, but at the end, this is another subject related to the Article 9 discussion, which is finance. And as you see, the finance is still missing. And you could create a package and get funds for these activities, for creating more capacity, blah, blah, blah. That's another subject of discussion. But I see very, very difficult to get your influence right at the COP. It has to happen before. It doesn't happen before, at the COP, it won't happen. That's what I will add, Lawrence. But it's an important point that he raised. I'm just trying to get clarity and understanding of different processes that are related to the negotiating activity, which is very difficult. It's not easy. Engaging in those negotiations is not easy. The technical understanding of those negotiations is not easy. But you will see. And just give you some political advice to strategize your points. I just want to highlight my next session. I'm bringing an indigenous. It's a good friend of mine, someone that we have trained, that will go with you from our region. Will go with you the technical aspect. When I met him 4 years ago, he didn't know anything about this. Now he's an international expert. So it's not difficult, it's just your will to do it. So that will happen in the session. There is another question.
Ok, merci beaucoup, Eduardo.